The amount of questions left unanswered when it comes to the sculptor's presence, reason, and purpose within the bayous of Louisiana are so insurmountable that even more than 100 years of history and research still leaves us wondering what actually transpired in those swamps at the end of the 19th century. But what little knowledge we have compiled over the years tells a horrific and gruesome tale of how what lies beyond the realm of the dead conspired to harvest and assimilate the living into unspeakable amalgamations from only the darkest of nightmares. While the sculptor's influence had been enough to corrupt, infect, and eventually kill off the local population of the bayous, it would seem that the desolate swamps weren't the actual target or reason behind the sculptor's arrival in our world, but rather an intermediate staging area for something of far greater magnitude. It would seem that the sculpture itself was more than capable of utilizing its corrupting touch and influence to manifest itself within people, slowly suffocating the life out of them with this disease, before turning their dead bodies into undead servants. However, in terms of recognizing threats, assimilating flesh and equipment, protecting its own environment, and actively furthering its own agenda, the sculptor required the assistance of several emissaries, each with their own individual task and purpose in the corruptions campaign within our realm. While not immediately obvious to any of the parties involved in the incident of Louisiana, when dissected in hindsight, a pattern emerges that reveals simple military strategy in the methods of approach used by the corruption. And the first step within any aggressive or invasive method of attack is to figure out your enemy's capabilities. The first of the sculptor's emissaries was cloaked by shadows and darkness. The bloody trail left by the blade of the assassin is one of the earliest testimonies to the existence of the sculptor's emissaries within Louisiana. Initially spotted in 1890, 5 years prior to the massive outbreak, but suspected to have been active in the area for much longer, it is believed that the assassin functioned as the eyes and ears of the sculptor within our realm, doing reconnaissance, trying to establish the most effective locations for the initial stages of the infection. The assassin would survey and map the area. At the same time, as stealth and discretion were vital aspects to the success of the sculptor's early plans, the assassin would function as a surgical tool, removing any immediate threat to the plans of the sculptor by identifying, stalking, and eliminating hunters or anyone who might have gotten too close to the truth about the corruption's presence and intentions within the bayous of Louisiana. The second of the sculptor's emissaries, more bird than man, its body, once a paraplegic soldier of the Civil War, had now, through the implementation of improvised prosthetics and grotesque surgeries, turned this former human into a dark silhouette considered by many hunters to be death itself. With its piercing screams of pain and agony announcing its presence throughout the bayous, Scrapbeak would function as a gatherer for the sculptor, like a magpie, greedily hoarding tools, equipment, weapons, and anything else it could get its hands on, allegedly providing the sculptor with the necessary materials to create, modify, and alter the other corrupted beings and entities found within the dead zone. The third of the sculptor's emissaries would be known as the Butcher. The Butcher was by far the largest creature within the dead zone, towering far above any other human, with the decapitated head of a pig as its crown, and the warped body of a meathead. This behemoth of fire and rage would consume the living with both physical trauma and relentless hellfire. Nigh invincible, immune to pain, and with unstoppable ferocity, the Butcher would serve as the sculptor's vanguard, suspected to lead attacks against prevalent problems within the dead zone. To use an analogy to differentiate between two of the active emissaries, If the assassin was the sculptor's scalpel, surgically and carefully removing problems one at a time, then the butcher was its hammer, instated into situations where brute force took precedence over sly cunning. The fourth of the emissaries was the arachnid terror, simply known as the spider, a description that was given to it by hunters and researchers who had only seen the entity from afar. For once observed up close, the striking horror would become immediately apparent to anyone that this horrific amalgamation wasn't just an overgrown arachnid, but rather the culmination of something so macabre and unspeakable that even the most deranged of psychotic minds couldn't have dreamt of its origin. As a walking mass grave, the spider would function as the worker of the sculptor, creating areas of hibernation where the cocooning of armors would take place. However, the spider would also seem to have a more natural purpose. As the sculptor's spread of infection and corruption is well known and documented to have been dispersed through insects, it is speculated that the spider, an arachnid driven by a primal instinct to hunt insects, would roam and protect the outer perimeters of the dead zone, immobilizing, dispatching, and destroying any rogue entities that would have fallen out of the sculptor's influence and wandered too far on the outside of the corruption's area of effect. The spider would essentially be the guardian of the sculptor's secrets. While active within the bios, each of the emissaries performed their specific tasks. However, the emissaries would suddenly find themselves targeted by the American Hunters Association. Having been singled out and recognized as being essential to the sculptor's campaign, the organization of hunters began offering lucrative contracts for the destruction of these agents of darkness. Finding themselves outmatched in the open fields of Louisiana, where the speed and agility of the hunters, combined with the power and range of their projectile-based weapons, would prove a huge disadvantage, the emissaries would retreat to their base of operations, the layers within the dozens of compounds, and instead of facing these new threats head-on, would let the hunters come to them, hoping to take them out in an ambush, where they would face these ferocious hunters in fierce battles. It is rumored that the slain corpses of these emissaries would grant the victorious hunter immense and untold powers beyond anything within the human realm. However, it should be noted that among the hunters, the researchers, and the affected civilians within the bios, the stories, tales, and exaggerated claims surrounding the infection and the emissaries themselves are almost endless. Hunter after hunter has told the fable of them slaying one of these agents of darkness. However, as no physical proof exists of anyone ever killing any of these emissaries, it makes the potential of these claims being valid highly unlikely. Which then begs the question, what happened to the emissaries? What happened to the corruption? And what actually happened within the bios of Louisiana? Ultimately, what the initial, mid-stage, and eventually end goals for the sculptor might have been, we will most likely never know. But we do know of some accounts that tell tales of the corruption spreading as far as New York before being eradicated. On top of that, hunters from as far as the Middle East, Scandinavian countries, and Far Asia, who were all familiar with the effects of the corruption, leads us to a vague conclusion that the spread of the infection was indeed a worldwide phenomena. However, as most of the documentation from this period seems to have been lost, destroyed, or hidden, what actually happened, how it happened, and how it ended will most likely remain a mystery for all eternity. Hey there, Hazmat here. This was my final video about the corruption itself, and I hope you've enjoyed it. As always, a big thanks goes out to the Hunters Lounge on Patreon, who helps me decide on future content and which you can join for a single $1 a month. Link is in the description below. I also want to thank Tip and especially Rexley from the Hunt Showdown Discord, whose interpretations of the lore has helped immensely shaping this final video. And thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one.